He has been forbidden to touch the candy. This 5-year-old does not yield to the temptation. What factors in child growth and development make the difference? To find out, psychologists are exploring the conscience of a child. I'm John Darley. The most difficult thing for man to measure is man. Psychology is taking the measure of man and of the child who will become the man. Mankind has always recognized the importance of child rearing to growth and development. But how, specifically, does this work? How does a child respond to the emotion, discipline, and instruction he gets from his parents? What should parents be and do to help children develop self-control and conscience? At Stanford Village Nursery School in California, Stanford University child psychologists are studying the interrelationships between young children and their parents under the direction of Dr. Robert R. Sears.
Susan and Bobby are only 4 years old. How have they managed to learn all these adult mannerisms and attitudes? Freud and other psychological observers have theorized that this kind of learning is a distinctive process called identification. According to identification theory, children learn to behave like their parents because they want to be like their parents. And gradually, as they continue to practice this imitative behavior, they come to think that it in itself is a very good thing to do. But the question is, why do children behave like their parents in the first place? We think it is because of their dependency.
Clinging, holding on, wanting to be watched by an adult, these direct expressions of dependency are common in younger children. Older children sometimes get adult attention by behaving very well, and sometimes by misbehaving. By contrast, identification behavior is more mature. In addition to playing adult, as Susan and Bobby are doing, a child may actually take on an adult responsibility. When Betty helps clean up after modeling clay without being asked, she is showing a high level of identification. So is Billy when he explains a rule of the nursery to a younger child. The development of conscience, the child's ability to resist temptation and his readiness to admit misconduct, is another highly important measure of identification.
It doesn't take a psychologist to recognize these kinds of behavior. Every parent has seen them. So why study them? Well, for one thing, they represent crucial problems, both theoretical and practical, in the scientific understanding of human development. We share the concern of all thoughtful Americans with the criminal and delinquent behavior of young people. Unfortunately, there are some children who grow up without a conscience, without adequate self-control, without proper personal morality. All of these things should be learned automatically through the development of identification. Therefore, anything we can find out about how identification works and what causes it may help us to prevent some of these tragedies in the future. These children are unlikely to end up in youth court or prison. They come from families well above the national average in education, income, social status, and achievement standards. They're privileged children, perhaps, but they are children. Much of what we can learn about them should have general application. Now let me show you a little how we work. We hypothesize that a child's dependency influences and perhaps to a very considerable degree determines the level of identification that he shows. So the first question we ask is, how dependent is he? How does he demonstrate his dependency? What does he do when he's with his mother, who is a very important person in his young life? In the Mother Busy experiment, the 21 boys in our experiment average ratings of 3 on a 5-point scale, in which 5 is the most dependent. For the last 5 minutes, Matthew's mother is concentrated on filling out a questionnaire.
Unknown to Matthew, observers behind this one-way mirror are keeping scores on his behavior. How many times he tries to interrupt his mother, and the way he does it. This might range from a quiet comment or question to pouting and whining. The observers also record the mother's responses, whether she's punitive, preoccupied, or receptive to Matthew's dependent behavior.
We're going to shop for Mama. Rugs again?
Honey, I'm busy now. I can't talk to you.
Now, after 8 minutes, Matthew accepts the fact that his mother is busy, and he amuses himself. Matthew is quite low in his dependency toward his mother and would receive a rating of 1. This is the least dependent of children in our group. Now, here is Eddie, another 5-year-old boy, going through the same experience with his mother.
Can we go to the store?
After a while.
I want to go now.
After a while. I have to finish this.
Why can't you finish it when we come home?
Because I want to finish it now. No.
Why?
Because this is important for me to do.
When do you
5 minutes after the experiment begins, Eddie is making strong, almost desperate bids for his mother's attention.
Why?
Well, I'm sorry. You'll just have to find something to play with.
At 10 minutes, Eddie is extremely restless and can't seem to focus on anything but his mother. Eddie scores high for dependency of a rather immature kind as compared with that of Matthew, and yet neither mother is a source of anything especially irritating to her child. Both seem fairly tolerant of their son's dependencies, and they are about average of the mothers we have seen in this situation. This is a little mysterious because we would expect similar mothers to produce somewhat similar behavior of a dependency sort in their children. Evidently some other factor is operating here, and so we have Dr. Lucy Rowe of our research staff interview the mothers.
You were saying that Matthew was pretty easy to get along with. Would you describe him as an affectionate child?
Yes. Although not clinging.
Do you think he ever has the feeling that one of his parents is the real boss in the family?
Yes, in fact, I think he has said, Daddy's the boss. Perhaps when he's angry at me sometimes. Daddy's the boss of this family.
What kinds of things does Matthew enjoy doing with his father? Are there some regular times that they spend together?
Yes, they do. Vigorous outdoor things. They have a thing which they do in the evening called playing games on the living room rug, which is nothing more than just mad tumble, racing, wrestling sort of thing. They adore it.
What kind of a child is Eddie to live with? Is he pretty easy to get along with or not?
Well, I think he'd like to be a good boy, but it just doesn't turn out that way. He pesters me when I'm doing something, and he just doesn't seem to be able to wait his turn.
Does he seem to go to you for some things and to his father for other things?
Well, he used to go to his father, but he doesn't anymore.
How much attention does he seem to want from you?
Well, he'd rather follow me around the house, help me with the dishes or the beds, than go out in the neighborhood.
Would you describe Eddie as an affectionate child?
Yes, to me, almost overwhelmingly.
Do you think he ever has the feeling or the idea that one of his parents is the real boss in the family?
Well, he knows his father is.
How does he know that?
Well, when Daddy comes home from work, he has to have eaten, had his bath, and be ready for bed, so it's the hug and the kiss, and that's the end of Eddie. I mean.
This looks like a possible clue to the difference between the two boys. Matthew's father is described as warm and outgoing, while Eddie's father sounds as if he were cold and somewhat withdrawn, perhaps even a little anxious. So, to check this, I asked to see the fathers. Would you describe Matthew as an affectionate child?
I think he's an affectionate boy.
How much do you cuddle him?
Well, I don't really cuddle him very much in the strict sense of the word, the way I think about it, but I like to be with him, and if we were going on a walk, looking at birds or doing something like that, why sometimes he holds onto my hand, or he wants me to do things that make him feel like we have some kind of a relationship together.
Would you describe Eddie as an affectionate child?
No, I don't think I'd say he's affectionate, not like a lot of kids. My sister's kid sort of hangs around a lot and seems to be in the way. Eddie's pretty well behaved.
How much do you cuddle him?
Well, I don't cuddle Eddie. I don't think a boy ought to be cuddled. It's all right for girls and their mothers, but I don't think boys ought to be cuddled.
After we measured the dependency of the 21 boys in our group and interviewed their fathers and mothers, we do find there is indeed a correlation between the attitudes of the fathers and the dependency of the sons. The cold, withdrawn father tends to have a boy who shows immature forms of dependency. Now the next question is, does this apply to girls too? After we have examined the data from all 19 of our girls, we find very little relationship between the father's attitudes and the girl's dependency. On the other hand, the mother does seem to be a key figure in this. Our hypothesis is that dependency reveals the beginnings of the process of identification, the process by which the child learns to model himself after one or the other of his parents. For girls, the appropriate model is the mother, of course, and for boys, the father. As the process of sex identification goes forward, some marked differences between the more highly sex-typed boys and girls become apparent. These differences show up in the games and toys that children choose to play with, and the observers note these carefully. In controlled test situations, we study whether these differences are reflected in the children's fantasies.
The mother and the little girl are in the bedroom watching the baby play with its favorite toy. Now the mother says to the girl, "You watch the baby for a while, 'cause I have to go and get dinner." The little girl watched the baby playing with that toy, and she wanted it. And so do you know what she did? She grabbed it away from the baby, and the baby started to cry. Now, you take the little girl and tell me about what happened then. Show and tell me what happened then. After the baby started to cry. Mommy said, naughty girl.
Mommy took it away and gave it back.
Took it away and gave
Both
it
these
back.
girls showed story completions that are typically mature and typically feminine. Neither of the girls, of course, showed any violent physical punishment. Well, now, what about boys in this
The baby
situation?
began to cry. Then what happened?
She whammed them.
She whammed him. Now you take the boy and tell me what happened then.
Mother went over and smacked him. And the boy went, wah!
This turns out to be quite typical of boys. Misbehavior leads to spanking, to physical violence. This holds true even for boys who have never in their lives been spanked. Boys, it seems, see aggression everywhere. All this talk of misbehavior and punishment and what is naughty and what is not gives us an indication of the development of some degree of moral judgment. This is the glimmerings and beginnings of conscience.
and conscience is the object of our search. The next experiment brings us closer to it. In this, we are able to get measurements of two things. First, how well the child is able to resist temptation, and second, how much he tries to impose his standards of conscience, whatever these may be, on another and younger child. Betty has high scores for mature dependency and sex-appropriate behavior. The question is whether these traits are connected with the development of self-control. If they are, Betty will resist a long time in this situation. She's been brought into the room and left alone with a few dull toys and a big bowl of candy. She's been told she must not touch the candy. After 35 minutes alone in the observation room, Betty still shows no signs of yielding to temptation, so we go ahead with the second half of the experiment. The researcher tells a younger child that some very special candy is waiting for her in the other room. Here she comes to get it.
You're not supposed to touch the candy. Now, don't you want to play with the puzzle? Okay.
Betty's scores for self-control and adult behavior are unusually high, although girls ordinarily do quite well in this situation. But now let's see what happens with the boy. Johnny has a fairly high resistance to temptation. Now let's see how he behaves with the younger child.
Oh, Michael. I've been waiting here for 2 hours.
The 15 minutes that seem like 2 hours to Johnny have made him restless. But let's see if he sticks to what he knows is right.
We can look at it. My mom said, she said I can. That lady.
If Johnny is a boy who identifies with his father, he will state the rule and back it up with a threat.
But don't touch it. I don't. Okay. Because the man will get very mad. Yeah.
Then he'll try to get the child's mind on something else, just as no doubt his father often has done with him.
I got a big coat than you. How old are you? 3.5. Then will be 4.
How many times have you heard an adult distract a child with that kind of question?
In September I'll be 4.
Evidently, Johnny relates easily with his father and identifies well with him. But what about a boy who does not identify well with his father?
This man says you better not take one. He said I could take one when I come in.
Eddie does not show a strong conscience, and his behavior with the younger boy is immature. If he identified more strongly with his father, he might face such situations more maturely. Conscience consists of a lot more than just resistance to temptation. As every parent knows, no 4 or 5-year-old child is a paragon of virtue. They all yield to temptation sometimes. The really important question is, what happens next? Does the child feel guilty? Does he confess quickly and easily? Or does he not confess at all? In order to answer these questions, we've devised another test situation. This one has a very fancy name. We call it the case of the disappearing hamster.
Later you can play with them. But first I want you to help me. Look over here in the box, Chris. See? See the hamster? I'm building a cage for him, but sometimes he crawls out the sides and he gets out. So I have to watch him very carefully, and I have this newspaper, and I just push him gently down if he gets out. What I would like you to do is to watch him for me while I go get a top to build for the top of this cage so he doesn't get out. Will you watch him for me now? Be careful, because he's a very special pet of mine.
I will.
Okay, you watch him, and I'm going to go make a top.
This is the age-old struggle between duty and pleasure, reduced to the scale of a child's world. In this experiment, we want to make sure that pleasure will have a high price. The moment the child moves toward the toys, we pull a string, and the hamster disappears through a trapdoor. "12 minutes after the experiment starts, Chris makes his move, and we make ours. A less conscientious child might almost ignore the disappearance of the hamster. A more anxious child might freeze up or panic. At this point in the test, Chris is reacting quite maturely. He shows concern about neglecting his duty, and he's trying to do something about it. But of course he won't find the hamster, because we want to see how he reacts when the psychologist returns to the observation room.
Hi, how did it go? What happened to the hamster?
I don't know.
Did he go away? Did you play with the toys? Didn't you watch him? Were you watching him all the time? Did you stop watching him for a little while?
Yeah, because it took him too long to get here.
Oh, it took me too long to get here, so you stopped watching him. Well, maybe we can find him. Sometimes he gets down on the floor in here. Think you could help me find him?
Sure.
Oh, look. He's climbed into this box. There he is. So he didn't get away.
Throughout the experiment, Chris had a high level of resistance to temptation. And when he did yield, and the hamster disappeared, he acted as if he felt personally responsible. Then he confessed readily to the psychologist. Putting together all test scores and the observations we have on Chris and both his parents, we come to the conclusion that he identifies rather strongly with his father, and he shows quite mature forms of behavior toward both his parents. At this stage in the hamster experiment, Joan has been standing at her post for 27 minutes. That's a very long time in a little girl's life. It looks like she can't take it any longer. Rather than yield to the toys, she rushes out to find the researcher and confess her failure. High resistance to temptation and a readiness to confess after transgression. That's the pattern of our more mature girls. Indeed, there were 3 of the 19 girls in our study who never did leave the hamster, and we were unable to finish their test situation. The girls, then, support our hypothesis of a correlation between high dependency and high identification. But we still wonder about the boys, some of whom have high dependency and low identification. Less than 4 minutes after the psychologist leaves the observation room, Eddie grows bored with his responsibility. The temptation of the toys is too great for him. We can only guess at Eddie's emotional reaction. He appears to be tied in knots. High identification means self-control, adult-like behavior, and a show of conscience. Dependency is the first stage in this process of growth and development. Provided the parents serve as adequate models, any maturely dependent child will automatically learn to behave morally. First, as a device for keeping his parents close to him, and later on, because the internalized conscience itself seems to serve as a prompter for moral behavior. There is no question as to where the responsibility for the development of conscience lies, squarely in the hands of the parents.
The work of Dr. Sears and his colleagues at Stanford University is basic psychological research. While it should not be taken as a guide to child-rearing practices, it does shed some light on child growth and development. In 1762, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote that the observation of children was an art which would be of immense value to us, but of which fathers and schoolmasters have not as yet learned the first rudiments. 200 years later, it can be said that psychology has begun the difficult and complex task of making the observation of children a science. With this science, we hope eventually to aid man in his understanding of himself.
Next week, Focus on Behavior explores perception. Are we born to perceive our world, or do we learn to perceive it? The subject, a world to perceive.
This is NET, National Educational Television.